Hey everybody, welcome to A Course in Miracles Applied. Today's topic is called Effort or Trust. It's based on an email exchange I had it's ongoing with Dave, a fellow course student, who told me that he felt he had a recent experience of overwhelming fear and felt that at that very moment, all of his mind training that the course is about was completely useless. And I agree with him in a certain way. He said if he had tried to do anything based on his own efforts in that moment, he would have made the fear seem even more real and more powerful to him. And I know exactly what that feels like. And it does feel like that the mind training that we do with the course in those moments of deep either despair or fear seems to be out the window. And that's kind of the jumping off point for this segment. And he says basically that, is it effort or trust? Is it our own effort that gets us through this difficult time, or is it trust? But the trust is a tricky thing because the fear of God, which that is, right, that what we're experiencing nullifies all trust, because otherwise if we would have trust, we wouldn't have the fear, right? So it's a little tricky. So we're going to try to kind of discuss it from a couple of different angles to see if we can get somewhere. There's one paragraph in the course that talks about this mind training that we do with the course, which is in chapter 1, really early on, chapter 1, section 7, paragraph 4. It says, "This is a course in mind training. All learning involves attention and study at some level. Some of the later parts of the course rest too heavily on these earlier sections not to require their careful study. You will also need them for preparation. Without this, you may become much too fearful of what is to come to make constructive use of it. However, as you study these earlier sections, you will begin to see some of the implications that will be amplified later on." So for me, this paragraph always had several messages. The first one was the most obvious one. States that the earlier sections of the text, because this is in the first chapter, right? The earlier sections of the text require careful study because what is to follow later on rests too heavily on these earlier sections. And you will also need those earlier sections, for preparation. Without this, you may become much too fearful of what is to come to make constructive use of it. Right? However, as you study these earlier sections, you will begin to see some of the implications that will be amplified later on. So he talks about, obviously the text, right? To study the early parts of the text. And then those will prepare us for what's to come later on when he talks about special relationships and, sentences like, "What is not love is murder," and all the deeper ego stuff, right? But he can't just talk about that. I don't think it's that small. I think for me, it's always that the earlier times of studying the course in our lifetime prepare us for what's happening later on when we get closer to the foundation of the ego thought system and look at what's there, right? And we need to have preparation to look at what's there. Otherwise, we will withdraw into fear. And as he says, we will not be able to make constructive use of this, looking at this fear. We will be too afraid to do anything, right? So that the early studies with the course, I think, allow us to prepare us for those later times when we dive deeper into the ego thought system. So what is then this mind training that Jesus talks about? And the workbook obviously is the biggest part of the course, where you have an actual mind training, and the mind training would be twofold. One of them, I think it trains our mind to realize that we have a mind. I think that's the biggest one, right? Because the ego's thought system is laid out in such a way that if we are in the bottom of the pit, in the world, identified with a body, identified with issues in the world, a victim of the world, that means we're completely mindless, because our state of mind is 100% dependent on what's happening on the outside, right? And the course teaches us first and foremost that we have a mind. Now that in itself can only be accepted, even if partially, if the level of fear drops, right? Because there's a reason why we deny our mind, we deny the power of our mind, right? So I'm gonna make this double line here, because everything that is above this line is the mind, right? And anything below that is the body and the world and our personality and who we think we are in this world, right? So there's a reason why we are in this world, or we believe we are in this world, and there's a reason why we're mindless, right? And the course lays bare all those dynamics, quote unquote. He says in chapter 5, the dynamics of the ego, dynamics in quotes, will be our focus for a while, right? Because before we can go past them, we first have to look at them. And that's why most of the course is, or half of it, is basically looking at the ego thought system with the Holy Spirit or Jesus, right? So there's a reason why we're here in this world, why we believe we're in this world and in this body. And we have a very strong identification with the body and the world. And the course says identification is salvation. That is probably one of the top 10 lines in the course that you could spend a week on, that just, unfolding it, what this really means for our process. Identification is salvation. We believe it is our salvation to be identified with the world and the body and issues, problems, and everything in the world. Why this is so is because of the layered defensive structure of the ego thought system, right? If we start back up here, we have love, oneness, heaven, and God. That is the eternal oneness of heaven that cannot be divided, that cannot change, it's forever changeless, right? That is our true nature. And then the tiny mad idea happened. The tiny mad idea says there is the possibility of an individual existence, right? It is only a tiny mad idea. It's not really anything real or anything substantial, except at that very moment, the ego, which is really just the thought of separation given life. The ego came into existence, and the ego's existence depends on the Son of God, the Son of God's power, right? The Son of God's power to the ego depends on it. Without that power, the ego is nothing, right? So the ego tells the Son of God, yes, there is not only is it possible to be an individual, actually you are an individual. But the price for that is the destruction of heaven, the destruction of your home, the shattering of the oneness of love and eternity, right? Because if you're an individual, then the oneness of heaven cannot exist, because individuality and oneness cannot coexist, because oneness says, it doesn't say anything, but oneness says oneness cannot be divided, right? If oneness cannot be divided into two or multiple parts, then if one part, an additional part exists, oneness must have been destroyed. The ego tells that to the Son, and the thought of sin was born, right? The ego says, this is a sin, this is a massive sin. You have killed God. You have destroyed your home in heaven. This is a sin. And what follows is this tremendous experience of guilt. And the whole course is really about guilt. It's about looking at that guilt that came from that belief in sin, to take the tiny mad idea seriously. So this overwhelming sense of guilt, which is still all in the mind, right? There's nothing material yet. This overwhelming sense of guilt, it completely blots out the other side, which is the Holy Spirit side, that memory of God, as the Course calls it, right? Guilt is the thing that blots out heaven, and guilt is the thing that blots out the Holy Spirit, right? As the Course says, it is guilt that has driven you insane, and it is guilt that keeps the memory of God from your mind. So guilt is the block, right? Because we have forgotten this and we have forgotten this, we have blotted it out, we are frantically asking the ego to tell us what to do with this overwhelming guilt, and the ego says, you must project it out to get rid of it. And we project it out. There's nothing in the mind other than us and God. So we attack God. We project our guilt onto him. Now this attack is completely impossible, right? Looking at it from the Holy Spirit's perspective, it is completely impossible to attack God. Ken mentioned this actor, and I can't remember his name. Shirley MacLaine was he was dating Shirley MacLaine for a while, or they were dating. And he was in a movie, and it was about a mouse that roared. The mouse roaring against the universe to make it shiver, right? My example would be a child has a little ping pong ball, and throws it against the Empire State Building and thinks that it can bring it down with this tiny little ping pong ball, right? So the attack on God, as impossible as it is, because we have forgotten the voice that says it's impossible, now we believe that we have attacked God. We have given our murderous self, we have split off this murderous self, this guilty self, the sinful self that believes it has killed the oneness, it destroyed the oneness of heaven. We have given all of this to God. We attacked God as we believe, and we have given him all of this unwanted, murderous thought system as we believe, right? At that moment, the fear of God was born. Because if we attack God, we must believe he will attack back and try to take the life that we have taken from him. And the Course talks about that in many occasions, right? An angry father pursues a guilty son. Kill or be killed, for there alone is choice, as the Manual for Teachers says, right? So our attack on God fear was born from that attack on God. And all fear we experience in this world, seemingly in this world, is nothing but the fear of God diluted into thousands of different forms and shapes. Fragmentation. That fear, not only, I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry. So the ego says now that this fear is so overwhelming, we ask the ego again, what can we do about this fear? Because again, we forgot this, right? This is gone and this is gone. So we ask the ego, what can we do about this fear? And the ego says, listen, the God is in the mind. We need to get out of the mind to be safe. So we fragment into 1,000 billion little pieces, right? If you believe in the room that you're in, there's an intruder, right? And you're afraid of that intruder because you think that intruder will kill you or will murder you. What you do is you leave, you open the door and you run outside. So that was the first step we did, right? We left the mind. At the very same time when we left the mind, the ego says, God can find one of you, but he cannot find and collect 4 billion or 8 billion or 10 billion of you. So the next step after leaving the mind is fragmenting. So we fragment into billions and billions of pieces, right? We make this world, this vast, quote unquote, vast universe with planets and suns and Milky Ways and grass, blades of grass and birds and all this stuff. We made that, right? And we identified now with one of those aspects in the world, because we believe identification is salvation. We believe we will be saved if we identify with the body, if we identify with the world. And how we can identify with the body is through issues, and the body is a perfect example of the ego's premise: seek and do not find, right? Because the body always breaks down, the world always breaks down. Financial systems, countries, cars, food gets bad, the weather changes, everything changes, right? So we believe identification is salvation. We believe we are safe in the world and in the body. And we're saved from this wrathful, vengeful God that awaits in the mind, right? So the mind is the scene of the crime, right? We leave the mind, we fragment, and we identify with one aspect in the world. Now the ego's goal is reached when we are fully identified with the mind, with the body and the world, and the ego thought system, right? Because this is now gone, right? This has 5 layers of protection before we can reach this. So the ego's goal is for us never to go back to this point. So it buries us under sin and guilt, under the attack on God. This is real. It's we attack God, we're afraid, we fragment, and we are in the world, right? The ego's goal is for us to be down here. Now, where in this schematic does the mind training now come in, right? The first part, as we said, is that the ego teaches us that we have a mind. Now, that's a little bit of a tricky thing, right? Because learning that we have a mind isn't a joyful thing. Right? Because the mind has all this stuff in it. It has the fear of God. It might have God that, wants to take our life. It has all this guilt and this sin. So we're not like jumping for joy when Jesus says, hey, you have a mind. Right? We think we do. It sounds great. But when it comes down to it, it is very, very hard to make that journey. This is not an easy journey, right? While we believe the ego that says separation is real and it is a sin and there's this overwhelming experience of guilt, this is hard. Until we come to a point where we realize, I couldn't have sinned against God, right? And then it becomes easier. But until that point, this is not an easy journey, as many of you might attest to. So where does the mind training come in? The first one is we have a mind, right? The second one is we have a split mind. The workbook basically teaches us that we have a split mind. We have a right mind and a wrong mind, right? If we look at lesson 93, that says, I only know the first sentence, I don't know this header. Light and joy and peace abide in me. The workbook reminds us that we have a right mind, right? Light and joy and peace abide in me. The first sentence, though, in this lesson says, you think you are the home of evil, darkness, and sin. So it tells us not only do we have a mind, but our mind is split. That's the second teaching. The third teaching, which follows logically from this, is that he says, and you, as the Son of God, have a choice between the two minds, between the two sides of the mind, and you can either choose one or another. If you choose one, the other will be blotted out. If you choose this, this will not exist. If you choose this, this will not exist. Right? And so we practice that for a while. We say, okay, I have a choice. If I feel angry, I have a choice. I have a choice to feel angry, right? We can practice that for a while until we hit a wall, right? It works all fine and like, ooh, I can decide for the Holy Spirit. That's amazing, right? And we practice that for a while until we hit a wall and we realize, I can see that I'm angry, but there's no way for me to decide at this very moment not to be angry or not to be afraid or not to feel guilty or not to feel ashamed or not to feel victimized by the world. There's no way for me, even though I know I have a choice for the Holy Spirit at any given moment, I cannot make that choice. Even though Jesus tells me you have a choice, right? Choose once again, chapter 31, right? He tells us all about choice. Now, why does he tell us that we have a choice when in our experience we don't think we do? Because we can't get out of the ego thought system so easily, right? He says, guilt is a choice, the attack on God, to believe that's a sin is a choice, fear is a choice, the fragmentation is a choice, and identification is salvation. To believe that is a choice. And that's all fine, right? That's the basis of the teaching that we have a choice. And then he says, even though I told you now that you have a choice, let's explore why you think you don't. Why are we still afraid? Right? Why is this fear coming up? Why can't we just decide against fear and go to the Holy Spirit? That choice that Jesus talks about is the foundation of the teaching of the Course. However, there's a fourth step to it, and one that we sometimes overlook. And he talks about it in this little prayer that everybody knows. I must have decided wrongly because I'm not at peace, right? I made the decision myself, but I can also decide otherwise. So this is a little prayer that leads us through some steps very early on in the process with the course. This is in chapter 5 in the course, and I think this is early on. This will have no meaning once we look at the fear of God. Just like Dave said, this completely blows out of the water once we come in contact with the fear of God. Because when he says, I want to decide otherwise because I want to be at peace, the honest response to that would be, no, I don't want to be in peace. Otherwise, I would be in peace. Right? So we have to kind of realize that Jesus talks in levels, in certain stages of our process with the course. Right? This paragraph will not come into play later on. This is a paragraph early on in the journey. And it's very, very helpful. Right? It's extremely helpful as a preparation so that Jesus says, listen, you have a mind, right? Let me get you through those steps, and you can apply them, and they will prepare you what's to come later on. But don't stay there, right? Don't use this for everything all the time for 30, 40, 50 years, because you will not get through the fear of God if you just use this. Because it's like a tsunami coming over you, and this little prayer will be completely gone, right? That's basically what Dave's experience is, and that's basically also what my experience was or is when it comes to that. So what Jesus says is, you decided wrongly, and then you denied your ability to choose. And we have to get back to that. We have to find your choice point again. In other words, the Son of God up here, right? When first the tiny mad idea of individuality came up, there's a way of saying, you know what, it's impossible. Oneness cannot be divided. There cannot be individuality, and it would have been back, right? But because the ego was born, quote unquote, this illusion was born, and we identified with its illusion, and ego said, you committed a grievous sin, and this massive guilt came into play. That decision was buried. That decision-making capability was buried under that massive amount of guilt. So now, when we feel this fear that Dave talked about, or when we feel we're attacking somebody, or we feel victimized by the world, or whatever it is, at that very moment, we cannot make a decision for the Holy Spirit, especially if we get further into the course. Sometimes we can, right? But there are certain issues in our lives, when we're really honest, that are very, very difficult to get past. There might be a person, maybe a family member, or an issue with health or money or something in the world that we're having an issue with, and it is almost impossible for us to get past that, right? So Jesus wouldn't say, no, you can just decide for me. That would not be kind, right? He says that for us to realize that we have this capability, this capacity to make a choice, but he also says, you have buried this choice deep, deep, deep within, and I'll help you find it, right? Our identification with the world basically nullifies our choice, right? If our body breaks down, nobody can say, oh no, I'm not afraid, right? If our financial system breaks down, if we get fired, or if we lose our apartment, or whatever it is, we can't say we're not afraid. We might we might be okay at that very moment, but it's eventually we will come in touch with that fear. The reason why we're so identified with this world is that fear, right? So that fear, when we make our way back up, we must get in touch with it. We must go through it. We must go through this, and we must go through this and come to this decision-making point, right? And the mind training that the Course gives us is basically that we have a mind, that we have a split mind, that we have a choice, and that whatever we're feeling in this world, whatever our experience is in this world, we want that experience, because that experience protects us from this first dream, as the gifts of God say, right? This first dream, this fear, this sin, this guilt, and eventually it protects us from love. So that would be the main focus of the mind training. Eventually will become to look at our state of mind at any given point during the day and realize that whatever we're feeling, whatever we're experiencing internally, independent of the exterior situation, whatever we experience internally is always some kind of fragmented part of fear, of the belief we attack God, of guilt, and of this belief in sin. And Jesus tells us that we want this experience so that we don't come in touch with this part of the mind, which in turn protects us from the love that is awaiting us in the memory of God. The double shield of oblivion is the world, and then the mind of the ego mind. That's the double shield that protects us from love. So when we're in this state of fear, there's really nothing we can do at that very moment other than to ask for help, look at the fear, and realize that the fear is not of anything external. It is of the fear of God. It is the fear to go through this mind, through this battleground, we're going back into the room where this murderer was waiting. We're going back into the room, but we're going with Jesus into the room. And he has the light, and he looks in all the corners, and he says, listen, there's nothing there. But we have to go back. We have to open the door and go into that dark room with Jesus, right? In order to realize there's nothing there. Because right now, we believe there's something in this mind which is absolutely frightening, right? This attack on God, this intense terror is in the mind. And the Course says the ego's goal in this is minimizing fear, right? Minimizing fear, but not its undoing, is the ego's constant effort. The ego wants us to minimize that fear, but not to undo it. Because if we minimize it, we keep it. We have just some fragments of fear that protect us from ever going back. And the ego's goal, obviously, as we said, is for us never to reach this point. Because at this point, the attraction of God would be so strong, we would just float back into his arms. Right? So the ego does not want to let us to this point. Like in football, you don't want to get the opposite team towards the touchdown zone, right? I have no clue about football, so anyway, but you get the point, right? This is like the ego's trying to tackle us when we start getting back into the mind. It's like no, right? Look over there. There's a problem in the world. Concentrate on that. Identification is salvation. You identifying with the world keeps you safe. And Jesus explains to us that the only identification that keeps you safe is love. But how do you get there? Right? We get there by looking at our identification with the world. That is really all that we can do. We look at each of those stages. We look with the Holy Spirit or with Jesus, whoever you feel is more for you. We look at this on each stage that we're in. And looking at it literally is becoming aware of how we feel. And realizing that however we feel, if we have an issue with our body, right? We can look at it and say, I think identifying with this body right now saves me from this tremendous guilt, saves me from this fear in the mind, and ultimately saves me from going back to love. That's all we do with anything in the world 24/7, right? That is the mind training. The mind training is the micro looking at the ego thought system, because the ego's thought system can only live, and we did a whole segment on this, in this fog, this twilight zone, right? In this oblivious state where we're not quite know what's happening. That is the perfect scenario for the ego, when we're confused, right? And the solution for that is to be very clear and say, if I experience my body, if that makes me feel anything that isn't peaceful, that is on purpose, and the purpose is to not pay attention to the mind, where I believe God waits to take the life back that I stole from him, right? And that is the mind training, a micro observation of our daily thoughts with the ego. And with Jesus, right? We always look with Jesus. We ask Jesus for help all the time. And that kind of a mind training then prepares us when we get deeper into this aspect, right? When we feel that attack on God. I was on a walk the other day, and I felt this attack on God, and it was not a happy feeling, I can tell you that. But it's good to feel that, right? And ask Jesus for help. And we might not feel Jesus for a while when we're in this space, right? And that is, I think, what Dave was mentioning, effort or trust. Where does the trust come in? And I'll get to that at the end. But the early stages of our work with the course, the preparation stage, is when we take Jesus everywhere, right? We take him to eat, we take him to go to the bathroom, take a shower, go grocery shopping, work, talk to people. Before we sleep at night, when we wake up, we try to get this relationship with Jesus going in the best way we can. And we look at our identification with the world with him. That's really the best way to do it. We say, listen, I would rather drive with the car than go with the bus. And we say, I'm identified with driving with the car, right? Please help me look at that. We don't try to change it, right? We just look at it. The looking is the solution for each of those steps that we have in the course. And the looking is really to become aware of that identification. We become aware of fragmentation, right? When we don't want to be with other people, right? We kind of want to be by ourselves. Or we fragment the fears into many, many, many things. Right? Fear is one. There's only one fear that we fragmented in, and then we have fear of thousands of different things. Right? But it's only one fear. That fear is of God in the mind. And after a while, all the other emotions that we have, jealousy or triumph or hatred or any other emotions that we have, basically boil down to fear. And that would also be part of the mind training, to realize over time that all those emotions that we have are really fear. And that is not a theoretical process, that is a practical, experiential process where we feel all those emotions no longer, and we just basically feel the fear, which is this fear, right? And the mind training here would be within this fear to take 1 second out and realize, first of all, this is not in the world. This fear is the fear of God. Please help me look at this with you. And we do that with all the steps that we go back up the ladder. Separation led us down. And then Jesus says, and he knows us very well, he says, and that's to the point that Dave made, my trust in you is greater than yours in me at the moment, but it will not always be that way. That's nice, right? Chapter 4, section 6, paragraph 6. My trust in you is greater than yours in me at the moment, right? If I'm here identified with the world and the body, the reason why I'm here is because I don't trust him. The reason why I'm here is because I don't trust the Holy Spirit. I don't trust God. If I tell myself down here while I'm a body that I trust God, Jesus can't help me. Where is trust here? Trust can only be here, and we can't go here until we're here, going back up, and then go over here, right? So trust in this ego thought system is impossible. The trust comes from us having done this work, and this is not like 2 years here, 5 years here. We go from here through here in 1 split second, we go over here and we go right back down, right? So we visit this ladder or this spiral millions of times before we get home, right? This is a long process, and we go back up. All of a sudden we have an inkling of Jesus's love or the Holy Spirit's love here, and then we go right back in here because the fear is too big for us to stay over here, right? The echo of that fear is too big. So Jesus says, my trust in you is greater than yours at me at the moment. And in one sense, Jesus says, listen, tell me about it. I don't want to hear that you trust me. I want to hear that you don't trust me. That's what he can work with, right? Looking at not trusting him is the mind training. Not telling him that we love him, that we trust him, or that we trust God. We are so far removed from trusting God, we don't even know, first of all, what God is. And second of all, we don't even know our mind that is in absolute, abject terror of God. And the whole Course tells us that, right? We can't just go back. Theoretically, yes, absolutely. We're the Son of God. We're at home in God, dreaming of exile. Love is the only reality. Oneness cannot be divided. Heaven is eternal, and God is a loving Father. But the moment we identify with the body, we are identified with the body because we don't believe any of this up there, right? None of it. And the honest mind training aspect of this would be to tell Jesus and say, look at this with me. I think I trust you, but I probably don't. That's a good start, right? Because we can't trust him. The fear of God reigns our lives. We cannot trust God. The Course works on building up that trust again when we, through all the beautiful, beautiful passages, the beautiful, beautiful passages in the workbook, right? Or in the manual that describe this magnificent mind, really, the state of mind when you're with the Holy Spirit. But this, we need that to look at this. If we just take that, all those beautiful passages, and stay there, we will not get to that point, because there's a big part of us that says, I can't go back because I'm too afraid. And we have to get from here back into the mind, look at this with Jesus, and then come to this point where we're free. Right? We're free of this belief in sin, and then we will naturally, the attraction to God, that's why the Course says God will take the last step. He's not taking the last step. The last step is of no consequence. It's not needed. Once we're back here and we're no longer attracted to guilt, the attraction of God will automatically pull us back in. It will pull the awareness of our mind away from the ego and back to the Holy Spirit. That's that point of freedom that the Course talks about, right? Where the attraction of love is stronger than the attraction of guilt, which the obstacles to peace talk about the attraction of guilt, right? We're attracted to guilt, and guilt attracts us away from the attraction of God. So we use all those beautiful passages in the Course that tell us unmistakably that we are a mind, that everything happens in the mind, right? And that we are a beautiful mind, not a sinful and guilty mind. Tells us all that, and we use that, and with that knowing, those bits and pieces of information that we get in the Course, we look at the attack on God. We look at the fear of God. We look at this guilt. Otherwise, if we only use those beautiful passages, we will not get back. Otherwise, Jesus would not spend 50% of the text on the ego thought system. He would only spend time on this, on the beautiful passages, right? He would not have put in the introduction to the text that this is not a course about love. This is not a course on oneness, not a course on heaven or us as the Christ or the one Son of God. This is a course on looking at the blocks that we have put in between us and the full awareness of love's presence within us. That's what it's about, right? This is the block. And we look at the block with Jesus, and that is the mind training over decades, right? We start where we are, and we slowly build on it. And we have a setback, we go 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but we keep going, right? And eventually we'll come through this, come out on the other side. We're here in the freedom of this moment. That is the eternal holy instant, and then the attraction of God pulls our awareness back to it. And then Jesus says basically that. He says, now what was seen as merely shadows before become solid gains to be counted on in all emergencies as well as tranquil times. That's in the Manual for Teachers in section 4, chapter 4, section 1. That mind training leads us through, and what was first merely shadows now become solid gains, right? We make our way up the ladder. We also gain the right mind, right? We become in touch more with the right mind. And the more we come in touch with the right mind, the more we can look at the wrong mind and not withdraw very deep into fear, right? That's the mind training. To build up this, it's almost like you build up this muscle of the right mind. And then you move something with this muscle. You just don't have the muscle so you can be Arnold Schwarzenegger in a championship, right? We need to use this muscle to move this block. And moving the block means looking at it with Jesus. And when we look at it with Jesus, when we look at this block with Jesus, it will slowly but surely disappear. This fear will disappear. The attack on God, that this is a sin, will disappear. The guilt will disappear, right? But the looking is what does it. And there's one more aspect I want to talk to you about, which is, it says here in chapter 4, section 4, it says the problem is not one of concentration. That goes to the mind training. The problem is not one of focus, right? Oh, I can't do the lesson because I can't focus on it. It is the belief that no one, including yourself, is worth consistent effort. We do not believe we are worthy of consistent effort because we think we're so guilty, right? So the mind training is not a matter of concentration or focus on the lessons. The mind training is for us to realize we don't believe we're worthy of the effort because we're so guilty. We believe we killed God. We can't be worthy of effort so that we feel better. We think not feeling better is salvation, identification with the problems of the world, with all those emotions down here is our salvation. That's why we want those emotions and those states of mind down here and those problems in the world. We want those because those save us, the ego says, from God's vengeance. What it doesn't tell us is that this keeps us from experiencing the peace of God. So it's not a matter of concentration. The mind training is not about consistently doing the lessons exactly what the lessons say us to do. It's impossible, right? And Jesus knows it. It is completely impossible to do the lessons correctly, because we're so afraid of where the lessons lead us, right? So it is not a problem of concentration. It is the belief that no one, including yourself, is worth consistent effort. So the mind training is to talk about, the mind training is there to train us to look at the ego thought system, not to do the lessons perfectly. That's not the mind training. As a closing, I hope this kind of gave a picture that makes sense. I'm rarely sure at the end of a segment if the segment made sense. I have no idea. I'm just hoping. So let me see, chapter, there's two paragraphs I'm going to read as a closing. One is from the text, chapter 12, section 2. There it says, when we have overcome fear, not by hiding it, not by minimizing it, and not by denying its full import in any way, this is what you will really see, which is the real world. You cannot lay aside the obstacles to real vision without looking upon them, for to lay aside means to judge against. If you will look, the Holy Spirit will judge, and he will judge truly. Yet he cannot shine away what you keep hidden, for you have not offered it to him, and he cannot take it from you. That's the first paragraph. Basically summarizes what we just said. The second one is chapter 13, section 3. It says, under the ego's dark foundation, here is the memory of God. And it is of this that you are really afraid. For this memory would instantly restore you to your proper place, and it is this place that you have sought to leave. Your fear of attack is nothing compared to your fear of love. You would be willing to look even upon your savage wish to kill God's Son if you did not believe that it saves you from love. For this wish caused the separation, and you have protected it because you do not want the separation healed. You realize that by removing the dark cloud that obscures it, your love for your Father would impel you to answer his call and leap into heaven. You believe that attack is salvation because it would prevent you from this. For still deeper than the ego's foundation and much stronger than it will ever be is your intense and burning love of God and His for you. This is what you really want to hide. On that high note, I'll see you next time.